Hello and welcome to the episode that will deal with the history of printing. Our subject expert is Professor M.A. Javed and I am Monica Verma. In this session, we are going to tackle the following topics. We will try to understand when regular printing of newspapers started in the world. What changes the printing press brought in the outlook of people? How the Indian press spread the knowledge of world affairs? How our press developed the spirit of struggle against the foreign rule. Historical background. The regular publication of news goes back more than 2000 years to at least 59 BC when Romans posted public news sheets called acta diurna. The word diurna means daily has been an important part of news ever since. The words journal and journalism have their roots day and the daily. Current or timely aspect of news has always been an essential factor in newspapers. Acta diurna, daily acts, were wall postings containing imperial dicta to inform the public on a daily basis about what the public had to know or do. Some historians consider these as the first newspapers, but it is doubtful if they reached many Roman subjects directly. Perhaps their contents were orally transmitted to the general public by those who were able to read them or by the town criers appointed for the purpose. The ancient Greeks had great orators like Demosthenes who spoke to hundreds or even thousands of people who would assemble in amphitheatres. Stones and parchment and manuscripts played a very large part in ancient days as media of instruction and enlightenment to the public. The Greek historian Dioscorus Coronis of the 4th century BC recounts how the Persian king Darius 522 to 480 BC, who extended the Persian Empire from the Danube to the Indus, could send news from the capital with the help of a line of men who would be shouting while they were positioned on heights. This kind of transmission was 30 times faster than using runners. In the Bello Gallico, Julius Caesar 100 to 44 BC reports that the Gauls, using their voices, could call their warriors to war in just 3 days using fire at night and smoke or mirrors during the day. This is mentioned in ancient texts from the Old Testament to Homer. In Julius Caesar's time, it had already been a well-tried practice to keep official records of important events. When many rulers, including Greek polis, used inscription for public information, writing became more flexible and efficient means of conveying information over long distances. Rome, Persia and Great Khan of China all utilized writing in the system of information gathering and dispersal, creating wide-ranging official postal and dispatch systems. Every schoolboy has heard of the great Emperor Ashoka's edicts on pillars and slabs of stone. His edicts inscribed on rocks in the 3rd century BC are found across South Asia from Afghanistan to Sri Lanka, and the writ writers had a prominent place in the royal household. Oriental monarchs had also recognized from the earliest times the necessity of news services. It was the custom of the emperor or king to appoint a news writer or wakia-navis in each district for these writers to send reports of important events. Both horsemen and dispatch runners transmitted news and reports. These reports were not always accurate, and sometimes they were deliberately falsified at the instance of those who had a grudge against the emperor. In China, the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 created a formal handwritten publication, the Tipao, which disseminated information to the elite in the Qing period between 1644 to 1911. Private news bureau sprang up which composed and circulated official news in the printed form known as the Qing Pao. The medium of communication of information developed from the clay tablet of Mesopotamia, the papyrus roll in ancient Egypt and in ancient Greece to parchment codex in Roman Empire. By the 8th century, paper introduced from China began to replace parchment in the Islamic world and spread to medieval Europe. Also from China, printing slowly diffused to Europe, aided by Moors' occupation of Spain. Thus, we see that memory goes back to a time when there was no journalism of some kind or other. Perhaps it should not be glorified by that name. Still, it was that in substance. Broadly speaking, journalism came into existence when the first newspaper was published. It was not until the 15th century, with movable type printing press developed by Johann Gutenberg, a goldsmith in Mainz in Germany, that means of communication were transformed. The press not only copied words mechanically, but it did with impressive speed, able to create limitless number of copies. This new technique for the rapid reproduction of documents in multiple copies gave a tremendous impetus to the development of science and technology. The findings of one investigator could be disseminated with reasonable ease and speed to many others working in some subject area. By the beginning of the 16th century, the printing presses were bringing out thousands of books in all major European languages. For the first time, scriptures were available in languages other than Latin, undermining the authority of priests, scribes, and political and cultural elites. As a consequence, according to Fabre and Martin, the unified Latin culture of Europe was finally dissolved by the rise of vernacular languages, which was consolidated by printing press. Coupled with vernacular translations of Bible by John Wycliffe in England and Martin Luther in Germany, the printing revolution helped to pay the basis for reformation and foundation of nation states and of modern capitalism. Early development of the newspaper. During that 150 years following the mid-15th century, printers had to fight monarchs for the right to publish. William Caxton, the first English printer, set up a press in 1476 and worked in relative freedom for 50 years, largely because he did not print any political news. When Henry VIII came to the throne of England, he feared the power of press, and by 1534 he had set up strong measures to control printing. For more than 100 years after that, the British maintained repressive restrictions on printers. Some were hung to death, while others were imprisoned for defying authority of the Crown. The first prototype newspaper was printed in London in 1621. In 1665, the first true English language newspaper was published in Oxford. It was called Oxford Gazette. 37 years later, in 1702, the first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, was published in London. In those 37 years, English printers of newspapers had won many rights, including freedom to publish without license. The postal reforms in England in 1840, with the adoption of a single rate, 1 penny postage stamp, irrespective of distance, revolutionized the circulation of newspapers. Newspapers in early America. New England was the birthplace of the American newspaper, but it was not until 1704 that a publication meeting all the qualifications of a true newspaper appeared in Boston. Nevertheless, in its lifetime from 1704 to 1776, Boston News Letter was rebuked by the government and publication was suspended several times. Most early colonial newspapers, like their European counterparts, existed primarily for the purpose of spreading information about business and commerce. Produced by printers, not journalists, they contained some local gossip and stories. In 1721, James Franklin began publication of the New England Courant. When he made a sarcastic comment in his paper about the British governor, he was thrown into jail and his 13-year-old brother Benjamin took over. Another colonial printer who ran afoul of the crown was John Peter Zenger, printer of the New York Weekly Journal, who in 1734 was thrown into jail for libeling the governor. After revolution, the colonial newspapers again served to encourage social action, helping to persuade the liberated citizens to ratify the Constitution and adopt a democratic form of government. In 1833, on New York Printer Day, began the New York Sun, and it sold for 1 penny rather than the usual 6 cents. In order to sell penny papers on a mass basis, the newspapers had to contain material of interest to many people. This economic factor led to development of the profession of news gathering. The man most responsible was James Gordon Bennett, a printer, who started the New York Herald in 1835. Day and Bennett both realized that to sell papers on the streets of New York, they had to have good stories and interesting headlines. Bennett started the practice of hiring men to go out and find news stories, and the modern news reporter was born. The penny press proved to be a great business. Within 15 months, Herald was having a circulation of more than 40,000. Other newspapers were started, such as New York Tribune and New York Times. With circulation ultimately reaching hundreds of thousands, these papers and their editors became powerful forces in society in mid-19th century, playing an influential role in the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, Western expansion, and American urbanization. Similar newspapers were started in cities across the country. Newspapers in Germany. Newspapers started appearing in Germany in the late 17th century, but they were only of minor importance, with censorship and other political devices throttling their development for over a century. Among the first newspapers was Zeeland. In 1727, when King Frederick William made advertising a state monopoly, he ordered the setting up in all major cities of the country advertisement an oriented newspaper entitled Intelligenzwang. The best known moral weekly, Der Patriot, was founded in Hamburg in 1724 by Barthold Heinrich Brockers and Michael Ricci. The easy growth in the number of magazines published in Germany was attributed to the legal restraints on the newspapers and the rise of the bourgeois and comparatively leisured classes. It was only in the 19th century that political and other news and informative and entertaining articles found their way into publication. In the early 19th century, a few magazines officially classed as books and therefore not subject to censorship came into being. A wider audience was reached by a different type of publication, including historic political periodicals which presented, analyzed and commented on the events of the months. In the second half of the 19th century, the German press started enjoying greater freedom, though it fell far short of conditions in the English-speaking world. However, in spite of unfavorable political climate, the German newspaper industry developed rapidly in the 19th century, aided by a steady growth of literacy, acceleration of communications by rail, telegraph and telephone, the development of large urban communities, and the invention of new, more rapid and efficient printing techniques. By the end of 19th century and in the last autocratic regime of Emperor William II, about 3,500 newspapers started appearing in the country, with a few dailies springing up in all the main cities. The Soviet Communist Press. Until the fall of communism and the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, there was no privately owned media in the USSR and no private advertising. All newspapers were published by the Communist Party or allied associations such as trade unions, collective farms and sports clubs. Because of the massive size and diversity of cultural subgroups in the erstwhile Soviet Union, very distinct layers of newspapers had evolved, which included a central all-union press, national in scope, and a regional system for each of the republics. There were 639 daily newspapers and 8,000 non-dailies. Many major national and regional papers in Soviet Union were published in both Russian and regional languages. Newspapers were published in 57 languages native to the USSR as well as 9 foreign languages. All newspapers were guided by the central government to ensure correct interpretation of current policies. The Central Committee of the Communist Party guided the press through its propaganda and agitation department. Pravda, the voice of the party and the most important paper of the USSR, was printed in 28 cities and had more than 60% of circulation outside Moscow. Izvesta served a similar function for the government on foreign policy. Red Star was published by the Defense Department. Western notion of freedom of press were rejected as being fundamentally unfree, as the Western media were controlled by capitalist economic interests, which prevented them from publishing what was called the Marxist truth. The communist press, on the other hand, had no profit motive. Macquill and Relofs identified the following basic assumptions of the Soviet communist theory of press. The media should act in the interests of and be controlled by the working class. The media should not be under private control. The media should perform positive functions for society such as socialization, education, the supply of information, motivation and mobilization of masses. The media should respond to the desires and needs of the recipients. Society has the right to use censorship and other legal measures to prevent and punish anti-social publication. The media should reflect a complete and objective view of the world and of society in terms of Marxist-Leninist principles. The media should support progressivistic movements everywhere. Much has changed since the fall of communism in Soviet Union and East European countries. Newspapers in early India. The story of the press and the history of freedom of the press in India have been tales of the constant struggle and progressive achievements under an alien government. The press, the great palladium of liberty of the country, has been linked throughout with the country's struggle for freedom and economic autonomy. Despite governmental suppression and bureaucratic high-handedness, the press played a glorious role in bringing about a national awakening and accelerating the dawn of independence. It inspired a sense of nationalism and created animosity for an alien imperialistic yoke. The first newspaper meant for publication was announced in September 1766 by William Bowles. He asked those interested to come to his residence to read the news from home and of ventilating grievances against the colonial administration. The announcement caused great commotion in official circles. His efforts were nipped in the bud when the Bengal government asked him to quit Bengal and proceed to Madras on the first ship that sails from the Presidency. On the 29th January 1780, James Augustus Hickey brought out the Bengal Gazette, or the Calcutta General Advertiser. It had 2 pages and was 12 inches by 8, brought out from Calcutta. Popularly known as Hickey's Gazette, it wrote sarcastically against men and affairs, especially against the administration of the East India Company. It took a leading part in blackening the name of Warren Hastings. When a malicious personal attack was made against Madam Hastings, the Governor General had recourse to law and published an order depriving Hickey of the privilege of circulating his newspaper through the General Post Office. The government action against Hickey, the first full-fledged journalist in India, was historic, as it was the first incident in a series of conflicts between the rulers and the press. Within 6 years of Hickey's brave efforts, 4 weeklies and a monthly were being published from Calcutta. The Indian Gazette, the second newspaper, was established in November 1780. In February 1784, the Calcutta Gazette, an Oriental Advisor, was published. In the following year, Bengal Journal made its appearance. In 1785, the Oriental Magazine, or Calcutta Amusement, was established as a monthly publication. Then, in January 1786, the Calcutta Chronicle came into being. Richard Johnston, a government printer, in 1785 started Madras Courier in Madras. 8 years later, Hirkaru was started by Boyd. In 1795, Madras Gazette made its appearance. In Bombay, the first English newspaper, Bombay Herald, appeared in 1784. Luke Ashburner started Bombay Carrier in 1790. The Bombay Gazette was established in 1791. After 1790, newspapers in India grew in number. The Asiatic Mirror was established in 1794. The Indian World, the Calcutta Courier and the Indian Apollo were started in 1795. The Bengal Hirkaru was started by Charles Maclean in the same year. The Telegraph and Oriental Star were founded in 1798. The pioneers of Indian language journalism were Serampore missionaries with Samachar Darpan and other Bengali periodicals, and Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the social reformer, with his Persian newspaper Mirat-ul-Akhbar, in which, in addition to comments on news, the Raja also engaged in theological controversy and propaganda for social reforms. In 1821, Raja Ram Mohan Roy had taken over Sambad Kaumudi, which had been founded in December 1821 by Bhavani Charan Banerjee as a weekly organ of Hindu political and social opinion. There were some newspapers in Persian at the end of the 18th century, but they were short-lived. No copies are today available. The oldest extant newspaper in the Jamai-Jahan Numa made its first appearance on March 28, 1822. It was a weekly priced at 2 rupees a month. The object was dissemination of news from English newspapers and all important cities of India. Another newspaper was to become prominent was the Bengal Herald, or Weekly Intelligencer, established by Robert Montgomery Martin, a surgeon, and Neil Ralton Halder. The paper was a weekly and was printed in English, Bengali, Persian and Nagri. In the meantime, Fardunji Murzban in 1812 established the first Gujarati press in Bombay called the Samachar Press. At first, he printed the Gujarati translation of Parsi religious books, but in 1822, the Bombay Samachar was started. There was an appreciable growth of newspapers in 1835, especially in Bengal. The number rose during the 2 decades preceding the Great Revolt. In 1873, George Campbell had ordered an inquiry into the state of the Indian-owned press of Bengal, and the result showed that 38 papers were in existence at that time. Till the outbreak of mutiny in Meerut, the Indian press was not viewed within extraordinary or unusual danger. The Indian press began to speak out against the administration of the company and openly sympathized with the rebels. The Doorbeen, Sultanul Akhbar and Samachar Sudabarshan were most outspoken. The Indian press was violent and exhorted Indians to further the revolutionary activities. The government on 13 June 1857 passed a new Act 15 of 1857 to curb the freedom of press. The Urdu press had its unique character. It played a very distinguished role in inspiring readers for India's fight for freedom. Who can even forget the epoch-making contribution by Maulana Muhammad Ali's Hamdard, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad's Al-Hilal and Maulana Zafar Ali Khan's Zamindar and Bande Mataram of Lala Lajpat Rai, Partap and Milap of Mahashay Krishan and Khushal Chand. In conclusion, we can note that expansion of printing presses was a major factor in the growth of worldwide newspapers. The Times of India was founded in 1838, while the Southeast Asian premier newspaper, the Straits Times, was started from Singapore in 1858. By 1870, more than 140 newspapers were being printed in Indian languages. In Cairo, Al-Ahram, Al-Arabic daily, was established in 1875. Japan's most respected newspaper, Asahi Shimbun Morning Sun, was founded in 1890. In Europe, the growth of popular press was unprecedented in the 1890. France's Le Petit Mail had a circulation of 1 million in 1890, while in Britain, the Daily Mail, launched in 1896, was doing a roaring business. Newspapers were used by leaders to articulate nationalism in many Asian countries. The Chinese nationalist leaders Sun Yat-sen founded Chung Jojib Pao, Chinese daily paper, in 1899, while in India, Gandhiji used Young India and Harijan to propagate anti-colonial agenda. Recap. In this episode, we learnt about the following topics: historical background of the press, early development of the newspaper, newspapers in early America, newspapers in Germany, the Soviet Communist press, newspapers in early India, conclusion. It will now be clear to you that the printing press revolutionized the way we got information. It gave birth to the movements of Reformation, Renaissance and freedom struggles in third world countries. That is all for today. Thanks for being with us, and we'll catch you soon.